All right, presentation number two. This time talking about pop and modern music of Ukraine. So, to break down the kind of general sound characteristics of modern pop music, whatever you want to call it, of the Ukraine, um, to kind of start in a way to kind of sum it up, it's much more westernized. I mean, you'll find that as opposed to kind of hearing those strict traditional Ukrainian, Slavic, European melodies with the traditional instrumentation of the kobza and the bandura and various other percussion and lute slash zither instruments. It's going to be more westernized and electronic. Kind of going to my second point, although very kind of modern and westernized, they do still do have some traditional elements, and I think that's kind of a unique thing about this region and this culture is that its heart and roots don't die in the progression of music throughout its history. You'll still find that in a lot of their music, yes, it is going to be much more contemporary and current, but those little melodic kind of hints or even kind of styles and structures are still going to be very present. There's that very, very distinct sound, especially vocally, that is produced when someone with that language and with that type of melody and harmonization are in mind will be present. And you'll even still find some traditional instrumentation within some of this current music, whether it's flutes or kobza or what have you. It'll still kind of make its place in that kind of music. Which this current music, this pop and modern music of Ukraine, it comes in different forms, which is really cool. It's not just like when you hear the word pop, it's that it's just all electronic, although a lot of it is electronic. It's not just that. It comes in the forms of pop, and especially there's a big Euro pop influence. Granted that Ukraine is kind of in that sweet spot, like right next to a lot of European countries, and so they get a lot of influence, as well as their kind of their Slavic roots, but a lot of Euro pop sounds, a lot of electronica kind of DJ sounds, a lot of rock music, even some metal music, which I'll cover when I break down some of the specific artists. There's some hip hop and even a little bit of jazz, not a lot, but just to kind of touch on that, so you can kind of see that it's eclectic. That the modern music of Ukraine is very eclectic. Kind of I mentioned before, some of the instrumentation is in with the modern elements, which are the more dominant instruments or sounds are like electronic instruments. So a lot of MIDI instruments, a lot of synthesizers, but also drums, electric guitar, and bass. Because as bands start to come kind of into full form, kind of more modern rock bands and more modern rock setup of drums, bass, guitar, and vocals. But like I said, with a lot of pop music, it's electronic instruments and synthesizers and what have you. But there, like I said, there also is still that traditional element that won't die in their music. So I noticed more prominently that there are more woodwinds or flutes when there is going to be that traditional element within kind of the current music. It's usually a woodwind, but I have listened to some of their music and identified that there is some kobza in there, which is that traditional lute, and then the bandura, which is that combo instrument between it's like a zither and a lute. And then to cover some of the languages, mainly Ukrainian, obviously, but some of the artists do sing in English, and even for a period of time, and there is kind of a Russian element, where there were some artists that were kind of transitioning into singing Russian exclusively and kind of leaving the Ukrainian language, and there even is a little bit of a Russian kind of pop culture within the country of Ukraine. But I'm not really going to cover those specifically. I'm just going to stick to those who are Ukrainian exclusively, if I may say so. That kind of sums a little bit of those main characteristics, the general characteristics of the current music. So now we will go on to break down a little bit more of the timeline slash sound and evolution of modern and pop music of Ukraine. Okay, so to start covering some of the timeline and evolution of modern music in Ukraine, kind of summed it up together, but like kind of the 1970s and 1980s were not a super popular time for modern music and pop music internationally within their own country. It was starting to make a decent appearance. Mainly in the styles of kind of folk rock music, because this was around the time when rock music was, classic rock music was coming into full force, as well as kind of pop rock, soft rock, ballad rock music. But there's still a big emphasis on the Ukrainian folk element and style that will show itself within this era. So that's never lost. And a lot more singer-songwriters than bands, but there were a lot of bands, and they did more of the kind of ballad rock, folk rock, pop rock, whatever you want to call it. And there was, so to kind of break it down a little bit, there was an artist called Kobza, a band called Kobza. They were a folk rock group, and they used 2 electric bandras, which is really cool because instead of it being this kind of acoustic traditional aspect, they're advancing, they're evolving. So these are now electric bandras. So they're still going to have that traditional folk element, but they're starting to amplify it now. So those are 2 instruments that were featured, but they were, a rock band, so they had kind of the full rock setup. But they started playing with more kind of, I don't know, folk style music that was kind of inspired by the cool jazz movement. So that's already we starting to see the westernization of this style of music. And so, but they ended up really being more dominant in the rock field. But that's how they kind of started. Then to cover another artist, there is Sofia Rotaru, and I might not be saying that correctly, so forgive me. I don't speak Ukraine, but she was a pop singer, and she had more elements of Europop, but even rock. So, as opposed to Kobza, which was more rock inspired, now we're getting into the more pop inspired element. So there's the band and the singer songwriter juxtaposition that we're getting. But I feel like within these artists, there is kind of a balance between the pop and the rock. Either they started out as one and transitioned to another, or what have you. But so specifically with Sophia, she started out as a pop singer and then eventually started to transition into more rock music. Not super forward in it, but producers giving her the freedom, but also saying like, hey, like this is kind of what's in. Let's get some rock into it. Then there's another artist, and it's very difficult to pronounce, but it's Nazari Yaramchuk, something like that. Kind of a tongue twister. But again, another cat in the kind of pop folk rock, and a very emphasis on the folk aspect to it, because it's still singing about the people, still singing about poetry, still singing about the things that a lot of the traditional artists, way back when we were, in when I was speaking in the traditional presentation, those elements are still prominent within their music. So modern, but with the traditional elements. And then to kind of keep covering it, one other artist, and probably, I would say arguably one of the most important in the 70s specifically, for pop and modern music of Ukraine was Volodymyr Ivasyuk, and he was a songwriter. Um, and he sung a lot of folk pop music, but he was a poet. That's what he was really known for. He was a poet, and he really wasn't politically, active in his words. He mainly sung songs of love, which resonated with a lot of people. And he wrote a lot of ballads and a lot of those, compositions, ballad type compositions. But a lot of his works, eventually became renowned as Ukrainian folk songs. There was some issues with the copyright, some copyright issues, so they kind of remain as Ukrainian folk songs rather than exclusively his own music. So, which could say two things: one, hey, shame on you for not saying that it's his music, but also his music transcended beyond just an artist and became more of a national kind of anthem and an icon, which is really cool. But unfortunately, he died really early. He died in 1979. He actually was found hung. An off-duty sheriff or cop, security guard, found him in a forest that he was hung, and that devastated the country, but also it devastated Ukrainian music, and a lot of artists stopped. I feel it was like the pop music kind of took a halt for a little while. So there wasn't a lot of activity in the 80s, but we will see a resurgence kind of come back up. But yeah, a lot of those artists kind of stopped, and even some of them started singing in Russian. They just stopped singing in Ukraine and started singing in Russian, kind of what I had mentioned in the beginning. So very sad, obviously of his death and the halt that happened to the music in this time. But we'll pick up in the 1990s on the next slide. Okay, so now we're at the 90s. So this is where it kind of gets really cool. And I actually spent a lot of time listening to the music that I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides, and really enjoying it, actually. So yeah, to get back on track here. So then in the 1990s, Ukrainian pop music began to actually make a comeback, as there was kind of that die down in the 80s. The 90s is where it really started to come back up. And a lot of it was because of this big music festival called Chervona Ruta Festival, which was a big music festival in Ukraine and housed a lot of Ukrainian, rock and pop music. And at first, they didn't think that it would be very successful, as there wasn't necessarily like the biggest market for it, but it actually was very successful and led to helped a resurgence of an inspiration for kind of modern pop rock music in this country. And one artist specifically to pay attention to, was Green Grey. And they were a huge success, easily the biggest band in Ukraine at this time, at least rock or pop band in Ukraine at this time. They were the first ones to get endorsed, and they got endorsed by Pepsi. They were playing concerts internationally, and so it really kind of opened up this path. Like, okay, it's possible. We can, as artists, we can actually make this happen. We see Green Grey doing it. Why can't we? So they really kind of opened the doors for this. So they were a band, or they were a rock band dominantly, but they had a lot of electronic elements. And I feel like in the 1990s, there was, there were a lot of rock artists, but they had a lot of electronic elements, a lot of kind of DJ turntable elements, some industrial elements, and this band really had that. They had a lot of kind of turntables and synthesizers, electronic drums, but also full rock drums and rock guitars, and very energetic. And it had elements of even funk and some hip hop in there. feel like if you were a rock band in the '90s, you definitely had a little bit of hip hop or turntable scratching in your music. But to kind of a little bit of a comparison to some Western artists like Red Hot Chili Peppers, very similar to Red Hot Chili Peppers and Incubus and Smash Mouth, more in the '90s than currently. I'm not even sure if Smash Mouth is even making music now, but you can kind of get the gist of it. A little rock with turntables and funk and some hip hop. So that was kind of their vibe, their aesthetic, but really, really cool. And obviously, speaking in all Ukrainian, it created a really diverse and unique sound. But they were very modern. They didn't really have that traditional folk element with either the traditional instruments, or even traditional melodic styles. It was very current, very Western, very 90s. Okay, so the 2000s now. 2000s to present. This was definitely my favorite part of the project. I listened to a lot of these artists that I'm going to talk about, and really cool. I even made a playlist, with a lot of these artists, and I'm constantly playing it, and yeah, really, really love it. So this is a great time for modern music and pop music in Ukraine, because this was probably the most prominent era in its history for music to be popular in this country, not only nationally but internationally. And a really cool aspect of it is this is kind of a time where the traditional folk elements make a resurgence, both in the instrumentation but also in melodic styles and ideas. And usually that comes in the form of vocal melody. I feel like when I'm listening to a lot of the instrumentation, it's more, I guess, Western style melodies, but I'm not an expert in it necessarily, but I definitely hear the the traditional like folk vocals, vocal melodic ideas in a lot of these artists. But a lot of them are pretty modern or Western in their songwriting. But you will see a lot of these traditional folk elements come back. And when it comes to the instrumentation, it's definitely more focused on the woodwind side. I feel like there's a lot of flute in their music, which is a very common traditional folk instrument in Ukraine. But it is very modern, so you're still going to have a lot of electronic elements as well as traditional rock band instruments, guitar, bass, drums. But within this era, the modern music comes in the form of rock, European pop, Europop, metal, even alternative music, some folk music, and even some hip hop. So it's a melting pot of music during this time. So to kind of go through, I feel like it's important that I break down some specific artists that cover a lot of these genreical bases. So to start out with one, Okean Elzy, which means Elza's ocean in Ukraine. They started in the kind of mid to late 90s, but had a lot of music in the 2000s. So they really can kind of go back into the 90s era, but I'm mainly covering them in the 2000s. They are kind of an alternative band, so not heavy on electronics at all. Really, focuses on the acoustic side of music, but they still have a lot of kind of folk melodies, and lyrically more folk, but they're also very politically charged, and so they sing a lot about politics, but it's very poetic in a sense. So Okean Elzy is really, really cool. I thoroughly enjoy him. They even have some more ballady styles of music, ballady songs within their discography. The next artist is Kazka, and they are a Europop or kind of dance music style group, and they're a three-piece, I believe. And one of the members does play the flute, so you actually have that traditional element already in this band, instrumentationally, if that's even a word. and they were a major success. So they're probably one of the bigger artists to come out of the Ukraine to breach out of the Ukraine and into the international world as they appeared on the X Factor, and I believe they were a big winner on that show. And so that got them a lot of success, obviously, because they were on TV, which is really cool. And they're a very palatable group. So really anybody can get into this artist, get into this band as their pop sound translates into what a lot of kids listen to. They're very current, very modern, but like I said, they have a lot of tradition. They carry a lot of traditional melodic styles and ideas, and even some of those traditional instruments. So very cool artist. Very electronic in nature as they are a pop band. Then we're to move on. We have this band called Jinjer. And I actually already knew about this band before learning about Ukrainian music, both traditional and modern, as they're a metal band that I actually very much enjoy. And not a ton of metal bands. I'm not covering any metal bands outside of this band in this presentation, as metal music in Ukraine isn't very big. There was a little bit of a wave of death metal and black metal, but that really never reached the masses, which is maybe a good thing, as black metal doesn't necessarily have the greatest ethic background. But this specific artist, Jinjer, really cool. They sing in English, unlike Okin Elzy and Kazka. Jinjer sings in English. And they are very popular worldwide. They get a lot of frequent radio play in the U.S. I hear them a lot on Sirius XM, on Liquid Metal. And they even have played in San Diego, right by at Brick by Brick, which is a venue that my band plays at a lot too. So really cool to see a band branching out of their own country and coming over here and being very popular internationally into the masses. And they don't. I don't really hear a lot of traditional melodic ideas in their music. Traditional to their country. It seems very like current, very Western when it comes to metal. But even what's interesting about them is they actually have some elements of I don't want to say reggae, because it's not really reggae, but it's kind of reggae in some of their songs, but to kind of have a little change up, a little bit of a twist. So that's really cool. I even noticed that the singer, it's a female, it's a female fronted metal band, so she does scream, which is really cool. But she even has a little bit of some Gwen Stefani characteristics in her singing, which is kind of cool. So to move on from there is a band called Daka Braka, which I actually did a concert report on this band. Really like this band a lot. In fact, they were the reason why I chose to do Ukraine as my as the region to do these projects on. So Daka Braka is probably the most traditional out of all of these artists that I'm covering in the modern world. And so they take folk music, they take that traditional folk style and feel, but put a modern twist on it. Both in their melodic style, but also within the rhythms. I feel like rhythmically, it's very current, not complicated at all. So you get that kind of modern element out of that, but some pop elements, a little bit of hip hop. They even have a song called the Carpathian Rap, where it's not like there's no electronics. They're not an electronic group. It's all acoustic, traditional instruments like cello, woodwinds, and even some percussion. Even like the accordion or squeeze box, or the mouth harp. But but this rap song, it's a 4-piece, so a guy and then three women, and one of the women who plays cello does a little rap over some piano and cello, and the accordion. It's really interesting because it shows that it's traditional in style or in sound, but it has that current twist to it. So really cool. Love that band. The next artist to cover is Ankua. I think is how you pronounce it. And really cool about her, she's an kind of electronica modern pop artist with some elements of kind of traditional folk characteristics, like um, like melody, a lot of traditional melody. But she dominantly sings in English, but all still sings in Ukrainian in some songs. But she sings a lot of her music in English, so that also helps breach it out into more of an international audience, as English is probably the most common language on the planet. It kind of helps transcend into other cultures, which is pretty cool. So she's really interesting, a little softer in her music. Like Kazka is very, very, on the side of kind of dance and electronic music. A lot, like I would say, bigger. The production's bigger. Well, Ankua is a little bit more light in style, which is kind of cool. She's not super out there, I would say, like musically, like it's still very palatable. Although stylistically, in like her music videos, she's very out there. So I check that out. Pretty cool. Another artist to check out is the Hard Kiss, and they're an electronic band, but they're more like hard rock. So this kind of cover is like the rock, not metal, but rock. Very energetic. A lot of traditional vocal melodies within their music, and they do sing in Ukrainian. Very cool artist, but yeah, very energetic. And still, so they have a lot of like electric guitars and bass, but more like kind of electric drums, which kind of creates this really thick, large, energetic sound. So they're very cool. Last couple artists to cover, TMK, or Tanak Na Medina Congo, which stand in Ukrainian, it actually means the dance on the Congo Square. So kind of a fun little name, but they're kind of a hip hop group, bigger group, a lot of members, but they carry elements of rock and even funk in their music, while still they rap, and it's more hip hop style, electronics, turntables, all that kind of stuff. And then there is Montek, I think that's how you pronounce it, and he's a modern pop artist. So very similar to Ankua or Kazka, like I mentioned before, covering the kind of modern pop, Europop, dance music, which is probably the biggest style out of the kind of modern music of Ukraine. So that's that. I listened to more of those artists, or found more of those artists than anything else. So that's why they kind of show up a little bit more, but that kind of covers the basis of modern and pop music of this country. Again, a melting pot of styles, a lot of electronics now. The production is really big. With traditional music, there is no real production in their music. Not a lot of recordings and stuff, but it's very stripped down. It's acoustic. It's what you see. Rather, with the modern music, it's a lot of production, electronic synthesizers, and energy, big walls of sound. So it's kind of cool to see the juxtaposition between the two, but very cool to still see those traditional elements show up in the modern music. So hope you've enjoyed, and I've actually linked that little playlist that I made, and I'm still adding more songs to it, but a little playlist of Ukrainian music. So if you would like to check it out, it's in the little description below, and hope you enjoyed. Thank you.